Hey there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yep. Hear you perfectly.
All right, let me just, okay, great.
Okay, so we'll just wait a minute to let people join.
Cool. I'm going to see if I can get my earbuds in here. I missed that. What was that?
I said I think we can go ahead and get started and let people filter in because there's so much wonderful content
Yeah, sure thing.
from the book to cover. And I want to just start by thanking you for joining me. I know that you're super busy, and I so appreciate your willingness to have this discussion about the book that you wrote, which I and so many people um, who are part of my book club really enjoyed.
Hmm.
So I
Glad to
guess,
hear it.
just out of curiosity to get started, because I know that you're a composer,
Yeah,
where your dad is a physician.
there's my
What,
piano.
there it is. What caused you to write this book with him?
What caused me to write it? Um, I, I'd say necessity on his part and opportunity on mine. He'd been struggling to write this book for about 6 years when I came aboard. Uh, he knew it was in him to write. It was sort of his magnum opus, the summation of all his work. Um, and because of that reason, it was very large and it was painting on a bigger canvas than he'd ever done before.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about one condition or one issue. He's talking about the world and why the world is the way it is. And he even struggled to come up with a title for the book or a core way to frame it. It used to be called "Toxic Culture: How Capitalism Makes Us Sick." So it was not very inspiring in a way. It was like,
Yeah.
I just want to tell people what's wrong, and people close to him, including me, were like, well, yeah, it's got to have some hope to it.
Yeah.
So around 2016, he refigured that idea and came up with the method normal and wrote a book proposal, and he showed it to me, and I said, look, this is great. I need my help, um, because it was just heavy, it was dense, I looked at it the way a dramaturg would look at a script or a musical. How is the story being told? Is it fulfilling the promise of it? Is it fulfilling the intention? Are the songs in the right places?
Right.
And to my pleasure, it didn't take any convincing. He said, I was hoping you would say that. So for me, there's all kinds of reasons to do it and no reasons not to do it. Especially given that I felt like he needed me and I was the only person in the world who could have done it, really.
Yeah.
Because I know his voice intimately.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'm conversant in what he's trying to say. And we have we have a background of collaborating on writing before, so, but never like this. So it was basically like that, and obviously for me there were all kinds of like material incentives to doing it as well. You jump aboard writing a book that is going to get published. I've never,
Yeah.
when I write musicals, I'm at the piano like it's a pipe dream that a show is ever going to get seen.
Right.
Sometimes it does, but a book like this, there was a demand, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so I was getting on board a winning team.
And I mean, I think that's such a special opportunity to do that. And I think too, I'm a psychologist, and this book club is often, the books that we read are often written by psychologists or therapists. And I think that I assume, that you're in a unique position in that you're not in this you're not in the health field, you're not in the mental health field, but you were so intimately involved with the book that I bet that you bring a unique perspective to it, and that you became so immersed in the topic without having this be, the profession that you live and breathe.
Yeah, and people are asking me to talk about therapy related things on podcasts, which is, I mean, I know my own process, and I know something about people, and I do find a sneaky way to work with people one-on-one and doing what I call mental chiropractic. But that's not therapy, and I didn't train to do it. I made it up. I
Right.
take people and I help them adjust their perspective on a particular situation. So it's a targeted intervention rather than a long-term counseling.
Yep.
So I've always had an interest in people and an aptitude for listening in a way that helps people crystallize and clarify what's really going on in their minds.
Yeah.
See through their blind spots and things like that. And given that the book was about more than psychology or therapy, it was also about the world, and that's something I'm interested in because I live in it, and
Yeah.
I'm interested in pop culture and politics and all kinds of stuff. And the book's tentacles reached all over the place there, so it wasn't too much of a stretch for me. The science is outside my realm.
Right.
He did the work on that, and I just helped
Right.
him turn it into English.
And, I think that, to your point, there are two things that I think were done so beautifully in the book. The first is that there is a lot of science packed into it, but I think it's really digestible for the public. That these are topics like, talking about epigenetics and stuff like that. Those are, I mean, to some degree, like hot topics in the world of science, but things that aren't easily understandable, I think, to most people. But the way it's written is so digestible.
Well, it's also a matter of proportion and quantity. You should have read our first draft, which was twice the length.
And it's already a long book to begin with.
Already, it's a 500-page book. Our publishers kept saying to my dad, you don't need to prove your points so many times over again. People get it. They're going to get to a certain point of brain saturation. So knowing what to filter out, how much evidence is enough evidence, and keeping in mind that we're just trying to give people a context to understand what they're themselves and people around them are going through, so that we can get to the healing chapters at the end. We want to present information in a way that's useful and digestible. So I'm glad that was your experience.
And I think too, and I'm definitely biased as a psychologist, but I think that society too much separates physical and mental health. And I think what is also done so beautifully throughout the book is that, from one perspective, it's a book about trauma. From one perspective, it's a book about kind of, the holes in the way society, and, the health profession addresses physical and mental health. From one perspective, it's the intimate connection between physical and mental health. There's so many different perspectives and ways to
another perspective, it's a critique of late stage capitalism. And from another perspective, it's a manual on healing. Not really a manual, but sort of a primer, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But without any clear, easy how-to steps or
right.
Not trying to be a motivational book.
Right.
But it is connect with people's innate capacity and aspiration to move towards wholeness that we define healing.
Right. I think one thing, and this is something, trauma seems to come up to certain degrees in so many books these days, I think, because it's so prevalent as the myth of normal discusses, and people so much, and the book does this too, talk about big T and little t traumas. And over the years, I've started to question whether there are benefits to differentiating between big T and little t traumas. I understand that perhaps for the purpose, for psychologists or psychiatrists in diagnosing, it's important to distinguish, what's a PTSD level trauma or something like that. But I'm curious, given the book's evidence that all types and all magnitudes of trauma have these pervasive effects on both physical and mental health throughout the lifespan, what's your perspective on the importance or lack thereof of differentiating between big T and little t traumas?
Great question that I've never been asked before. I've wondered about that. I mean, I think it's really ultimately about the value or the utility of the distinction. If it's useful, keep it. If it's not useful, I think on one level, it's a handy way of, I mean, big and little sounds like large and small, you know, like it sounds like we're comparing magnitude, but
Yeah.
we're talking about capital T and little t to distinguish between trauma because of specific events and trauma because of patterns of lack,
Yeah.
you could say, or trauma caused by deficiencies.
Yeah.
So you can have, and the trauma, the big T traumas are not the events themselves, but they're the kinds of traumas that those types of events tend to
Yeah.
still. And I'll tell you a story. While we were writing the book, my dad did a live, this is during COVID, I think, did a live event with Daryl Hammond
Mm-hmm.
and the woman who directed the documentary about Daryl Hammond called Cracked Up.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Daryl was on Saturday Night Live for something like 15 years. Like he was one of the longest reigning ensemble players, and he was never that flashy. But like Phil Hartman before him, he was just the kind of just character guy who could play anybody. He played Bill Clinton. His most famous role was probably Sean Connery in Celebrity Jeopardy. Hilarious guy, and
Yeah.
also deeply, deeply, deeply disturbed, like self-harm, self-cutting, addictions, bipolarity, you name it, which he was hiding for a long time. And the documentary is about his journey and discovering that, in fact, it wasn't a brain disease. It was a response to having had his mom kick the shit out of him throughout his childhood, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that's a big T, clearly a big T trauma. And when my dad gave his definition of trauma, my sister and I were both watching in different cities, different parts of the world. And we were WhatsApping each other. She said, "Did you see Daryl just like kind of dissociated? He kind of just checked out." And we could see that he was, and not 5 minutes later, he cut in. And he said, "Wait a minute. Kind of sounds like you're saying that everybody is traumatized. But if everybody's traumatized, then what did I go through?" And that's when I realized that I don't know if we'd made the big T, small t distinction before that event, or we hadn't made it as important. But for people who have been through incest, rape, abuse, the ravings of an alcoholic parent, fearing for their physical safety,
Yeah.
or war or genocide or whatever, it's not so much that the scars that are left, you can't compare, but I do think that constitutes a category. And even just to make it, again, like you talk about digestible, for Daryl, it was not digestible just to have a definition that flattens out trauma. We
Yeah.
need to have room within our big definitions to have understandings of different kinds. And one of the interesting things is, I mean, small T trauma is no picnic either because it's harder to spot.
Yeah.
Where did it come from? My parents loved me. I had a happy home. I had a normal childhood. You know,
Yeah.
meanwhile, I have an eating disorder, or I'm depressed, or I have a chronic illness. You know, it can be harder to connect those dots because we sometimes come out of our childhoods protective of those memories.
Yeah.
So every kind of trauma has its perils and its pitfalls. But I think we did just feel, and also because the big T ones are the ones people recognize, the ones they know. So we need another name for the ones people don't see.
Yeah, and I think, to some degree, I mean, whether it be friends or whether it be, therapy clients, will have people come to me and say, well, I had a little T trauma, as a way of almost like diminishing or apologizing for calling it a trauma. And I think that there's, to some degree, it might be a coping mechanism, saying to yourself, oh, it's not that bad, or it's not as bad as other people experience. But given, the evidence in the book, it seems that putting it in this, I understand the benefit of differentiating it from these really large scale traumas, but calling it like a small thing, it almost potentially make someone more susceptible to developing other mental illness or physical illnesses later on because they're pushing back what they've endured and not allowing themselves to heal from it.
It's an unfortunate part of the metaphor that the letters are known as big or small.
Right.
We could say
right.
capital E and
right.
and minuscule in French. I'll tell you this: I had both in my childhood.
Right.
I had a few big T traumas. Being yelled at by my father in fits of unpredictable rage, and being slapped once across the face for not singing "Happy Birthday" to him in front of the entire family and sent home without cake. Everyone was horrified, but that was a big T trauma. That was a terrorist attack on my nervous system.
Yeah.
But concurrent with it, there was a small T trauma of my dad not attuning with me. Why was I not wanting to sing "Happy Birthday" to him in the first place that day? Whenever my dad tells the story, and I have now revoked his license to tell the story in public. It's my trauma, goddamn. He says, "Well, Daniel's just being a normal 3-year-old, and here I am acting out my." I said, "No, I wasn't being a normal 3-year-old. I was being your 3-year-old. I was angry. I was clearly getting back at you for something. Well, what was that? It was probably something subtle, something energetic, something where, and there were all kinds of those from both my parents. And those are the kinds that are the most pervasive, and they take the longest to, because they don't register as memories. And you can repress the story of a violent rape. That could one reaction, but those are at least events. What about just living conditions?
Yeah, and I mean that's something that I definitely want to bring up later, because I think that the chapters on living conditions and race and gender and socioeconomic status are so important, and things that society is so mistaken about, that I'm going to come back to in a few minutes, if that's okay. One thing that I kept thinking about is that resilience is something that so many people, if not everyone, in our society strive to have. And it's something that's so commended. You go through something and people say you're so resilient, and it's an admirable quality, and it's, something that you're taught to try to strive for. But by society's general definition of resilience, might resilience be more negative for us than we might expect? Might resilience go against the idea of authenticity that is spoken about so much in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes what society means by resilience is actually closer to insensate.
Yeah.
Hardened, calloused. I mean, we tell that story about Hillary Clinton in the politics chapter, this anecdote about her childhood that is not only normalized, but valorized by being put in a promotional video about what an inspiring, nevertheless persisted kind of girl boss. And the story is that her mother at age 4 tells her, "You go back outside and deal with those bullies who are terrorizing you on the street. There's no room for cowards in this house." And Morgan Freeman narrates this story live at the Democratic National Convention, and no one comments on it.
Right.
And that's what Hillary Clinton is known for. Well, she's so damn resilient that she didn't tell anyone she had pneumonia during the campaign, and then she collapses on the street in New York. And even when she does, she says, "I'm all right. It's a beautiful day in New York."
Right.
Then she wonders why half the country thinks she's a total phony.
Right.
So, some people are going to love your coping mechanisms, and other people are going to see through them. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I think, resilience, people sometimes mean that the personality is resilient, that the personality is resistant to change. I did a live stream earlier today on my podcast, which is about song lyrics. It's called Let Lyrical with Carice and Daniel, and we had Leanne Rhymes on our podcast, on our stream. She joined us. People can check it out on YouTube for the rest of the day, and then we'll be paywalling it. But she was talking about a song she loves by Tracy Chapman called "Change," and the lyrics are all about what's it going to take to make you change? What's it going to take to checkmate your ego how bad do things need to get? And I think resilience is sometimes celebrated in our society as the quality of not wising up, of continuing to persist in doing the same thing over and over again to please other people or to be admirable or to, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
Now, what true resilience would not really be a function of the personality. I mean, it could be a function of the will. There could be but I don't think of that as resilience. I think of that as determination, commitment, courage. What's really resilient is the authentic self because it can't be lost, really. We can lose sight of it.
Yeah.
So we need to find that thing in us that has been resilient. But look, I mean, what doesn't bend breaks, right?
Right.
It's an Ani DeFranco lyric. Buildings and bridges are made to bend in the wind, to withstand the world. That's what it takes. All that steel and stone are no match for the air, my friend. What doesn't bend breaks. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like that with human resilience, that the part of us that is actually vulnerable and malleable and supple and has some give to it is the part that can withstand everything that life throws at it. The part of us that gets attached or identified with a certain fixed way of being because that's what allowed us to survive, you know, a war zone in our home or just certain kinds of emotional deprivation. Well, that one doesn't, that's resilient to a fault because it doesn't know how to, it doesn't know that the war is over.
Right. Yeah, and I think, you know, if I may add on to that, I think people often mistake resilience from with being able to move past an event or forget about an event or repress kind of what happened or their emotions toward what happened. And instead, resilience is being able to process it and continue on despite it. You know,
well, maybe despite it or maybe because of it.
Right. Yeah. That's a great distinction.
You know, that you metabolize it.
Yeah.
You know, like there is no moving on.
Right.
There's moving on with it. But it's more like I have a musical that I've been putting off writing for years, but it's set in an existential baggage claim where you have to claim your baggage before you get on the plane. And claiming your baggage doesn't mean throwing it away. It means taking out whatever will fit in your carry-on and then leaving the rest.
Yeah.
But you have to go through it.
Yeah. No, I think that's, you know, a really good distinction. It's not moving on from it, it's moving on with it.
Yeah.
You know, the book says that the following qualities are prominent among people with chronic illnesses, including cancer, autoimmune disease, migraines, fibromyalgia. So the qualities involve or include compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring one's own needs, rigid identification with social role and responsibility, and a need not to disappoint other people, you know, which, as the book points out, are things that are considered really great qualities for people to have. You know, I imagine some people might read this and think, wow, there's a strong link between chronic illness and these qualities, but I don't want to let go of these qualities. These are things that I want in myself. Do you have any recommendations for how people can maintain semblances of these qualities that are perceived as so admirable without sacrificing their own physical and mental health?
Yeah, well, there's two ways I could go with that question. Number one, you can have compassion for the part of yourself that doesn't want to let go of something because it's really worked for you.
Yeah.
And there's fear underneath that. And the fear is worth looking at. The unwillingness is worth looking at. And you know, you have to be able to really weigh what it's given you and what the costs are. And a lot of people may say that before they've actually looked at the costs.
Yeah.
You know, and if you really get in touch with your own mortality and what your body is telling you, sometimes life turns up the heat. But I would also say that there's another, I mean, that's probably what my dad would say. And he'd also say, well, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned and blah, blah, blah. And that's all fine. But I would take it in a slightly different direction as well at the same time. Hopefully, you know, both two paths that lead around the same tree and end up at the same junction. How do you keep a semblance of it? Well, the good news is that those qualities that you're holding on to are already themselves a semblance of something. They're a shadow of something. They're a distortion of something. What do I mean? We'll take compulsive niceness. Because, by the way, we're not talking about being a kind person who cares about people. We're
Right.
talking about compulsively doing for others and neglecting yourself.
Yeah.
Never putting on your own oxygen mask, putting it on everyone else's oxygen mask, even if you pass out.
Right.
Not being able to say no to people, okay? You want to make the case to me that that's a quality worth holding on to? I don't think so. I
Right.
but what it is it's I think of it as a hijacking of an innate quality, which is kindness.
Yeah.
Only a person with a good heart and a desire to be there for people and a sense of empathy and fellow feeling is going to recruit that quality to become a nice person.
Yeah.
Someone else is going to distort and amplify out of all proportion some other quality of theirs. You know, so if it's a quality of rigid identification with duty and role, which is another one of these traits, well, discipline, pride, wanting to do good work in the world, these are genuine callings.
Yeah.
And the thing to notice is that even on its own terms, if you say, well, I want to keep that in my life, okay, good. Well, you better separate the wheat from the chaff, because in the current form, it's completely compulsive. You have no choice over it. You'll run yourself into the ground. It breeds resentment and stress for
Yeah.
yourself. It's blind to what other people actually need, so it's undiscriminating. And it's probably going to have you live less long or less functionally. You're going to crash at some point in some way or another. We all do when we're doing things compulsively, and you're not going to experience choice or agency or really knowing other parts of yourself. So there is always something to grieve when we have to let go of cherished things, but also I think it's highly tempting to exaggerate what a complete overhaul it's going to be. Now, some people who get to the deathbed, the cancer bed, you know, you talk about Eve Ensler or Anita Moorjani or some of these stories we tell in the book. These people waited until the very direst warning, and those people had a radical transformation in their personalities, because that's what it takes.
Yeah.
That's what we're called for. But if we can catch it earlier, we can start to loosen. You know, my favorite one of my favorite spiritual quotes is, maybe it's from A.H. Almas, that, you know, enlightenment is really just the ego loosening its hold a little bit, like that it no longer has you in its grip. You have it rather than it has you. And
Yeah.
that's all I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, the stories about people who were able to process what happened to them in the past and saw these kind of miraculous recoveries from cancer or other illnesses. I mean, it's really astounding, the power that I don't even want to just say changing your perspective, but accepting who you are and making a commitment to live with it. You know, it's incredible what it can do.
Well,
So,
it
yeah,
gets you on your own side,
yeah,
maybe for the first time in your own
yeah,
life. It's like a realignment of your own forces on your own behalf.
yeah, yeah. Someone wrote in and said, I was amazed to learn that my own trauma history might help explain my diagnosis of chronic migraines. I've been in therapy for years to process what's happened to me. How else can I mitigate the physical pain that I endure on an almost daily basis?
Well, so now you're bumping up against the edges of my expertise. I'm not a therapist,
Sure.
anything about migraines. Um, I can only speak as a mental chiropractor, and I have to assume that alignment in the mind and the way we're thinking would affect mental stress, and mental stress, whether experienced or not, is going to manifest itself in migraine headaches for someone who's prone to them. I would say mental hygiene is really important. And when I say mental hygiene, I don't just mean mental health. I mean thinking clearly, seeing clearly, um, being very sensitive to what stresses you,
Yeah.
and listening to the early warning signs, um, learning what your body needs and what it's, you know, basically like Here's your first warning, here's your second warning, learning to sensitize yourself. Oh, it's time to rest, But then also looking in your life of what am I tolerating? What am I putting up with? What that thing I do, where am I still doing it?
Yeah.
you
And
know, and
yeah,
asking that as a form of genuine inquiry and also prevention. Because I don't know how migraines work, but if they're like anything else in the body, I mean, think of the metaphor of a headache.
yeah,
There's too much cluttering the brain, or it's banging around. Like, what would make the head hurt so much? And the nausea that comes with it, and the full body, whatever. It's something. There's some too muchness or something.
yeah. And I think too, I don't want to speak for this person, but I think often people think of the trauma as ending at the discrete event or the series of discrete events or the
Yep.
environment, whatever it might be,
Yep.
and realizing that the way people then go on to interact, you know, for years or decades with other environments or other people can be a continuation of the trauma. And so the work is not just processing what happened in that event, but how it's continued to affect you.
Well, if you want to know what happened in that event, it's good to look at how you're acting now.
Yeah.
It's like I couldn't really. It took me experiencing some catastrophes in my adult life before I could get back to. I could follow the trail of traumatic breadcrumbs back to my own childhood and be like, oh fuck, that's what it was like.
Right.
And and in that moment, like I realized, oh, all my dad and mom's description of my childhood has been not that helpful to me. I needed to remember it, and not just like know about it, but literally remember, the opposite of dismember. I had to like put the pieces back together,
Right.
be like, that's what happened in my body, or in my emotions, or in my soul, or at least speculate, oh, that must have been what happened. Like that's what would happen to a kid in a situation like that. And
Right.
then I'm meeting myself again in a way, but it had to happen through, a disastrous marriage and divorce for me, or like going to jail in Mexico for 3.5 weeks, which also happened uh,
Right.
for, a whole totally other story. But whatever your life is serving up for you right now, whatever afflictions or distresses or difficulties, you could take the case that they're little reenactments in some certain ways.
Yeah.
So,
I it's hard because I keep wanting to say one of my favorite parts, but I had so many favorite parts, but I think the discussion of the clash between attachment and authenticity
yeah,
was a really, really powerful one. And I think the book lays it out really well, but it's, I think, an important discussion to continue nonetheless. For people who maybe forgot about that section or didn't get to that section, how would you summarize, the clash between attachment and authenticity?
sure. Well, I mean, this is one of my dad's patented, you know, trademarked little modules, attachment versus authenticity. But it basically describes the fact that two of human beings' basic non-negotiable needs are the need to attach to caregivers, which is from the moment we're born, we completely depend on it. First physically for years, but also emotionally, because that is physically, because that affects our brain development. We can't live without it. We'll literally die without it. So it's a powerful, powerful drive that the parents also participate in. Their brains are wired to attach with their babies, which is what makes babies cute, which is what makes parenting not, in the best of circumstances, it's worth all the effort, right?
Right.
In a stressed world, the innate pleasures of it are harder to come by.
Right.
So that's attachment. And that's non-negotiable from the start, and it stays very important throughout childhood, even into the teenage years. But the teenage years are when the culture is supposed to say, okay, you've reached the end of that road. Now here's a rite of passage to, but we don't have that.
Right.
So, but teenagers trying to sort out how much attachment is too much,
Right.
and how do I get my other need met, which is authenticity? But we're born with that need. It's not just a teenage need. Human beings need to be in touch with their gut feelings. And that's how my dad defines authenticity. It's knowing how you feel, knowing what your body is doing, and responding to it like any cat or any dog or any sentient creature without an ego or a superego knows how they're. And we needed this on the. It's not just airy fairy new age Instagram stuff. Authenticity.
Right.
If you're out in the wild and there's a rustle in the bushes, and you don't trust your gut instinct, well, you're going to be in someone else's gut, you know. So these things are both important, and also the long-term goal of development is to produce autonomous, and autonomy and authenticity have the same root in Greek, human individual, right? Well, what happens if those two needs come into conflict way too early in life? What if the child gets the inescapable message that for me to be fully authentic would be to risk the attachment relationship?
Yeah.
And it could be something really severe, like I'm going to get beaten, or it could be I'm going to get love withdrawn. I'm going to get a timeout. I'm going to get disapproved of. I'm going to lose access to this kind of connection that I want with my parents, that I love, that is nourishing and sustaining. Well, that feels like an existential threat because the attachment drive is so strong. We don't have the capacity at that point to say, oh, well, seems that my parents have a limited capacity to meet me where I am. Their bandwidth is limited. I guess I'm just going to have to be myself and wait until I can get old enough and get out there in the world and find people who will honor me for who I am. And kids can't do that. First of all, they're complete narcissists, so they think everything is about them. It's their fault, so they have to change. Also, the present moment is forever. There is no future.
Right.
And they need the attachment more than they need the authenticity now in childhood. You can actually leverage your authenticity against the attachment and do okay because we're very adaptable. So this is one of the downsides of being so adaptable. Well, the upside is it helps us survive.
Right.
The downside is if there's no one there to witness and help us process the traumatic imprint, then it's going to get imprinted in stone and we're going to forget it was ever different. And now we've lost the connection with that authentic part. And that's when the problems really start.
Yeah. And I think too, I know the book primarily focuses on attachment in childhood, but, research shows that those attachment patterns continue into romantic relationships, through adulthood, and that a lot of people continue to see that conflict between authenticity and attachment, in dating and marriages and figuring, if I act this way, this person is not going to respond well, so I have to kind of become the person they want me to be. And, again, that's something that perhaps some people might see as admirable or, they're being malleable, but that it really is detrimental above all else.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where we get to learn how resilient, how flexible is my authenticity.
Yeah.
If I'm in a relationship with somebody, the authenticity is not a rigid kind of like my way or the highway, that's
right.
That's authenticity on steroids, or that's coping with not because authenticity has some flexibility to it. Authenticity can say, well, I'm not getting what I want in this moment. I may even have a preference or dislike of this, but there will come a time when I can express myself about it. But at this point, I want to give this person the space to be how they're being.
Yeah.
So it's not about having hair trigger boundaries.
Right.
Boundaries should be, flexible, and an authentic person aligns their behavior not just with their self-concept or boundaries, but also their values and their loves and whatever. But it's about knowing, okay, ultimately enough is enough for me, knowing where my limits are, knowing what my bottom lines are.
Yeah. I said I was going to come back to this, and here I am coming back to it. The section on epigenetics, I found really interesting. I did some research when I was in grad school on epigenetics, and how perceived support in early adolescence from parents and peers predicts epigenetics, through adulthood, and how that predicts mental health. I think that, and maybe I'm just naive in this, but my perception is that as a society, we're kind of taught, or we hear that women are more susceptible to certain physical health problems, or racial and ethnic minorities are more susceptible to physical health problems. You think about a basic biology class, or a basic psychology class, and you're taught about whether it be gender differences or racial or ethnic differences or even socioeconomic differences in different forms of chronic illnesses. And I had never thought about the perspective that, it's not genetic differences, it's epigenetic differences. And for anyone who might not know, epigenetics, and in a brief summary, is basically the science of understanding that it's not necessarily our genetic makeup, our biological makeup, that determines who we are, how we feel, the illnesses we develop, but rather how our environment and relationships and things that happen to us, either when we're alive or before we're born, impact our genes' abilities to express themselves, and how that has a pervasive impact on the disorders that we develop. And that's a very brief, summary of it. Why do you think it was so important in the book to address that it's really the epigenetics and not genetics, as people may believe, that predict these significant differences among?
Well, I think, I don't know that we would say that everything is due to epigenetic effects, but that epigenetic effects are a thing, and they're widely misunderestimated, as George Bush said, George W. Bush. I mean, look, a 5-year-old could figure out that it can't be genetic, that women are more susceptible to this and that, or that black people in the United States are, or that indigenous Canadians are, or that poor people are. All you have to do is ask, well, what was the case 100 years ago? 100 years ago, autoimmune disease was roughly equal between the sexes, and now it's about 75% women. Genes don't change over that period of time. If we look at black people's rates of hypertension or whatever, well, do their African genetic relatives have the same thing? No. Same, indigenous Canadians, diabetes, suicide, blah, 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 blah. Were these diseases or conditions known before people like you and me got here? Almost never, if at all.
Right.
What happened was, you don't even need epigenetics. A way of life got destroyed, or women are placed in an impossible bind in society, and subjected to stresses that men aren't, or black people are the inheritors of just a ton of cultural trauma of 400 years of chattel slavery, and then however else long of its aftermaths, and they're still living in the same place, dealing with the aftermath of policies that have been very detrimental, and all of the internal cultural effects of that. Well, of course it's going to be bad for people's health. And it turns out that on the very level of gene expression, that's also true. We also talk about telomeres, which are these chromosome sheaths that shorten as we get older, and that they mark biological age as opposed to chronological age, and that among people who have had more chronic stress in their life, these telomeres get shorter a lot sooner than someone who's had it, more smooth and easy. So the reason that's important is that the genetic explanation is the go-to superstition, the religion of modern so-called the science, or sort of pop science. And as someone once pointed out, it's all in the genes is an explanation for the way it is that doesn't challenge the way it is. Because if it's all in the genes, well. Now we can sell drugs to mitigate it, or we can do early detection or whatever, and that the capitalist machine has more products and services to sell. But if it's about the environment through no fault of people's own, well, then we might, if we actually gave a shit. And
Yeah.
that's an open question. Are we committed to people's health? Do we want that? Well, then we might ask some questions about how we're living. And some of us might have to face the uncomfortable question of, might I have to give up some of the goodies and the
Yeah.
treats that I take for granted are mine, and now you start to get into social reconfigurations and wealth disparities. But yeah,
Yeah. And
I think the core message of the book is, it's a song from the musical Showboat, it ain't necessarily so.
yeah.
And the genetic hypothesis, which Bill Clinton was flogging back in the 90s, we're about to map the human genome, and it's going to explain everything. We're no closer to understanding anything really genetic. But the prejudice towards the genetic explanation is still very strong. So
Yeah.
we're fighting upstream to get people to like snap out of that.
Yeah. And perhaps it's the convenient or easy explanation. And I don't want to misquote this, but I was talking to someone recently who I think told me that most cancer research to this day is done with, I think it was white men. And it seems like, especially given all the evidence that the book shows, that's such, that's so behind the times, and not considering the way that chronic illnesses impact, you know, people so vastly differently depending on who they are and the environments in which they grew up.
Yeah, I mean, the word intersectionality has become a culture war flashpoint to the point that it's almost meaningless now because it's bandied about by everyone But if there's one area where it's not abstract or academic at all, but actually very concrete and material, it's in the health realm.
Yeah.
That the different intersecting lines of stress vectors, that's what oppression is, that's what marginalization is. It's a pathway by which chronic stress is going to be visited upon one person more predictably and regularly and arbitrarily than someone else.
Yeah.
And where these intersections cross each other, you're going to be at the receiving end of way more stresses on your nervous system outside your control, and the lack of control itself is a stress.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that anyone is, rich people get cancer all the time.
Right.
And people who have had a comfortable life are deeply, deeply traumatized. But that doesn't erase the fact. And, people, you see comments sometimes on Amazon, the negative reviews, the few negative reviews always go to the top, and you look at the myth of normal. And I never do. My dad will sometimes. I'm like, Dad, what are you doing looking at the comments? Like, he sent me a Reddit thread earlier today. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is because he's doing this event with Prince Harry,
Yeah.
on the weekend. And I'm like, this is not what you need to be spending your time doing right now. Like, but people will say, oh, they're letting people off the hook. They're saying, you're sick because of racism. Well, you can either look at the effects of things or you can not.
Right.
And we're not being reductive. We're not saying any one thing causes anything else, but there are studies that show about likelihoods and predispositions and whatever. And if we could develop I think we live in such a blamey culture that people think that if we're discovering links between people's oppression and their life experience and their health, that now, everyone else is to blame. Well, not everyone's not to blame, but we are connected.
Right.
We are implicated. It should concern us that some people in our society are at the receiving end of stresses for no good reason, and they're affecting their, and so I mean, the genetic assumption is pernicious and insidious, and so we went to some lengths to try and debunk it.
I really appreciated that section because I think it's something that doesn't get um, discussed enough.
Yeah.
You know, I know that the last section of the book focuses on healing, but a large part of the book talks about society's contributions to the impacts of mental health on physical health and on trauma on physical health. And, um, particularly the medical field. I maybe not particularly the medical field, but including
Particularly the medical field.
how the medical field really falls short in serving people and protecting them against illnesses that arise among so many. I can imagine that for some people this might feel discouraging, as they might feel, okay, I can do the work that's in my power to try to heal from what I've endured, but if my doctors or society aren't doing their part, how much can I really change? What would you say to people who walk away just feeling like they can't trust their doctors or rely on their doctors or rely on society as a whole to help them?
Yeah.
I know that's a large question.
Well, look, even if it was the case that there are no people out there in the medical, let's just take the thought experiment. Let's just say every single health provider, psychiatrist, doctor is completely closed-minded, will never listen to any of this, doesn't actually want to listen to their patients. Well, even then, you'd still want to at least know that, so you don't bang your head against the wall. Maybe you go get like alternate healthcare from, the shaman down the block. I don't know,
Right.
but that's actually not the case. There are people who want to provide, but they got into health to help people, and they've been co-opted and captured by a system that doesn't incentivize taking time with people and listening to people and asking. When patients start to advocate for themselves, interesting things can start to happen. Now, you may have to fire a doctor or two. You may have to look a little longer. And don't even get started on the cost of healthcare. I don't even know and we barely talked about that actually in the book,
No.
which we didn't talk about just the straight fact that in this country, and increasingly in Canada, those who can afford to live, there's medically assisted suicide happening now in Canada, and people are choosing it because they can't afford their own treatment.
Right.
And this is just reported on as like a neutral kind of poignant fact. It's horrific.
Yeah.
No wonder the cultural conservatives are up in arms. Like there really are strange trends afoot,
Yeah.
where we can take our like compassionate, we can have such blind spots because we think we're being kind to people, but we're not asking the question of why is it this way?
Yeah.
What are we tolerating? What are we normalizing? What was your question? I lost it.
Just what would you say to people? And you've
Oh
already
yeah.
expressed this, who feel
I would say that autonomy, healthy anger, these are healing things, and the medical system will give you all kinds of opportunities to practice them. And that if you express your needs and again, there are some people who are so prone, who are such at the bottom of society's power ladders, that it's going to be extremely difficult. And that it's just me talking about this is like speaking a foreign language. If
Yeah.
you're living in a dirt poor area where there's almost no medical care, and the people providing the care are themselves stretched to the limit, your choices are limited. Autonomy is a function of choices,
Yeah.
a range of choices, power, freedom, and so some people don't have it, but to the extent that you do, you just do your best.
Yeah. And
Someone just said isolation brings depression, and I would say that's the other thing, being all alone with it. We need people, and we need to connect with people, and I think the fact that this book is doing so well has to mean that there's a growing sense, and not just among patients, but doctors and health practitioners are taking an interest in it, and so there's a groundswell of something.
I agree, and I have to say that I was perhaps not surprised, but it without explicitly saying it, the book talks about the hospital that I work at and physicians that work there, and it hit hard that um, that this is happening all around us. And what I'm about to say, I think, comes from a place of privilege of being able to say this. But a friend who's in the medical field once recently said to me, and I think it's so true, is there might be the best doctor in the world, but that doesn't mean that that person is the best doctor for you.
Uh-huh.
And that if that doctor, might have won tons of accolades for the specialty that they're in, but if that person isn't willing to listen to you and what you've endured, that doesn't mean that they're going to sue you well. And often I have people come in for therapy intakes and will say, oh, I don't know if this is too much information, or I don't know if this is what you need. And I'm not an MD, I'm not a physician, but what I would say to anyone, and what I say to my own clients, is no information is too much information. And if you think it's relevant to the reason you're coming in, or if you don't even know if it's relevant, but something tells you should tell me, that it's relevant. And that's where the advocacy with doctors comes in, that you have control over what you tell them. And unfortunately, we don't have control over how they respond, but that no information is too much to tell them, especially when you're fighting for your own health and well-being.
100%. And also keep in mind that doctors are trained in the business of cure, and cure can be a real Faustian bargain, because now you're chasing to get rid of symptoms, to treat cancer as the enemy, to give yourself more time. But more time to what?
Yeah.
What are you going to do at that time? Healing, on the other hand, may take into consideration, okay, how do we lessen these symptoms? But I mean, hopefully it would. And can we reverse the disease? If we can, let's go for it. But healing is about wholeness. Healing is about understanding, and so that's not something your doctor will necessarily be oriented towards, but they may be able to get on board it in conjunction with the cure thing. And this is why there are people. Obviously, there are like miracle stories in our book about people who who were cured spontaneously, remissions of terrible diseases, but every doctor said you're dead in a few weeks, and they're still alive today. And they did it with no medical intervention, with no chemotherapy, with
Right.
whatever. The stories I like are the ones where there was a combination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone did psychedelics and they did chemotherapy. I'm not saying one is better than the other.
Right.
But in terms of digestibility and accessibility, what we're saying is there's no contradiction.
Yeah.
It's a question of the spirit in which something is done.
Yep.
And who you get to be when you're doing it. And because healing is ultimately about coming more into your original self, or your fully flowering self.
Yep. I'm mindful of time, and I'm so appreciative that you've taken this time to share your wonderful perspective. Are there any last thoughts that you want to leave people with, or any takeaways from the book or the discussion?
I saw someone in the comment thread asked if it will be translated to Arabic. I believe so. I don't know when any of the foreign translations are coming out, but there is a book deal for the Arabic language translation. No, I don't have any parting thoughts. I can take a question or two before I go.
Yeah.
But I would just say, read it in good health and subscribe to my podcast.
Yeah. Tell people where they can, follow everything about you.
Sure, I'll plug. So Walk with Daniel, my mental chiropractic service, is at walkwithdaniel.com. And you can book a free 15-minute call with me to, hi Australia. And I've done walks with people in Australia where I'm walking in Brooklyn and they're in Melbourne or Sydney or wherever. And we can discuss, whatever it is that's stuck and see if it's a good fit. Someone wants me to talk about Hello Again. I can do that. And then I'll have to go. But, and then my podcast is called Let's Get Lyrical with Carice and Daniel. And if everyone at this very moment would go over to your favorite podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, just while you're listening, just click subscribe. Just hit subscribe, follow us, go to YouTube, follow us there. it's a lot of fun. We talk about songs, everything from Tupac to Indigo Girls to Metallica to Stephen Sondheim to, and we had Leanne Rimes on today, and we were talking about Bobby Gentry and Bob Dylan, uh, and I played her a song by Busta Rhymes. So I was like, your cousin, Leanne and Busta. So anyway, it's a fun show, and I would love to have everyone come on over and listen. So those are the two things that I have to plug right now. And if people are interested in my musical theater stuff, danielmatte.com.
Awesome. Well, thank
And
you.
as far as Hello Again goes, that's the name of the workshop that my dad and I have been doing since 2016 on parent-adult-child relationship. The subtitle is A Fresh Start for Parents and Their Adult Children, and that'll be the topic and title of our next book, which we're getting started with very soon. And that obviously for me is a much more personal
Yeah.
Mountain to climb, that book. I mean, this Myth of Normal, my name is smaller on the title because I was the co-author. I came to help it happen. Hello Again was essentially my idea, and it's very close to my heart and close to the bone and more difficult to talk about. And I think also even more universally applicable because not everyone wants to look at trauma in the world today. Not everyone's ready to look at their own trauma. Not everyone's interested in those topics. I mean, they should be, but not everyone is, and that's fine. Everyone has parents that are either alive or dead, and many people have adult children, and no one's talking about it. And it affects everybody's life.
Yeah.
It's a very consequential relationship, but it's not an essential relationship anymore because you're not a kid anymore. You don't need them, and they're not responsible for you anymore. So you can get away with, I'll see you at Thanksgiving.
Right.
And it is what it is, and however it is, that's fine. And maybe it'll improve a little bit. We'll do therapy here. But what would it look like to take this relationship on its own terms and say, what are the unique problems of this relationship? It's a problematic relationship for a very good reason. It's unlike anything else. It's the most unequal relationship at the start of it. One person didn't even choose to be there.
Right.
And then 20 years later, you're supposed to find a way to exist in the world as two adults and whatever, especially in a world where it's very highly likely that some huge rupture in the relationship happened through nobody's fault, but it's a fact, it happened. And so we're just mapping out that territory, and
Amazing.
and if people want to get a sneak preview of it, there's hours and hours and hours of footage of us not just being interviewed on podcasts, but on YouTube of us giving public talks about it at the previous workshops. I think the one from 2016 has been viewed something like 400,000 times.
Wow.
And you look at the comment threads and you get a range of the intense feelings people have about this topic and the very different personal prejudices and projections.
Yep.
It's fun. It's fun, and it's going to be intense, and I'm a little scared, but anything I've ever done that was really worthwhile, any musical I've written, I had a little bit of fear writing it, and that's all artist made. So wish me luck.
Good luck. I mean, it sounds like a wonderful topic, and I already have a list of people in my head who I'm gonna to tell about it. So thank you so much for this. This was wonderful, and I so appreciate your taking the time and your perspective.
My real pleasure. I'm glad we made this happen, and thank you, and thanks to everybody for being interested, and I hope you enjoy the book if you decide to pick it up.
It was a wonderful book. Have a good evening.
You too, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Bye.